Welcome, everyone. I'm Ellen Lukens. I'm on the full-time faculty at Columbia School of Social Work. We're here today to talk about something that we're both passionate about. So I'm joined with Professor Yamile Martí Aydar, who is my co-facilitator today. And we're also joined by Anna Balakrishnan, who is an alumni and also an adjunct professor here at Columbia. And Anna will be working with us to field the Q&A. So thanks so much, Anna. And also thank you, Tiffany, for such a wonderful introduction and also for talking about the sense of community and collective effort that we're trying to build through this series. So our title today for this first in a series is Psychoeducation as an Aid in Navigating the Impact of COVID-19. And this very first session, which we're using to set the stage, is entitled Naming the Experiences and Beginning to Cope. Next slide. So what we'd like to do first, as we've just done, is to introduce ourselves and our audience, or our participants. And we want to reinforce that we're really thinking about attending to and considering the needs of our participants in this work. The goals for this module on psychoeducation is to introduce the model and model at the same time to model the content. So our first question, which we'll address in the first part of the seminar, is what is psychoeducation? And in a nutshell, it's basically the synergy between education and psychotherapeutic interventions, focusing on the idea of synergy. That's really important. And then why psychoeducation? Yamile and I have thought a lot about psychoeducation. We know a lot about the principles and theory. We've taught, we've supervised, we've done research and evaluation on this model. And much of what we've learned is from our participants. I would say certainly much more than half. So it is really a practice that sets the stage for leveling the playing field between the participants and the facilitators. And why now? Why are we thinking about psychoeducation in the context of COVID-19? It's really, this is a situation where we're all learning. It's unprecedented. None of us, or maybe a very few, but in our lifetimes have experienced a pandemic in this scale. And so we're learning together, which really undergirds the whole theory and principles associated with psychoeducation. We'll review the key elements of the practice, its structure and content. I just want to take a minute to sort of emphasize what Tiffany said, that the CSSW COVID-19 action team is a group of administrators and faculty who've come together wanting to give something back to the community. And so this is one aspect of that. And then within our work today, we have embedded a mini session on stress and coping that we'll talk you through. And we've also embedded questions and answers throughout as a way of garnering your input into the practice. Okay. So this module is focusing on stress and coping, and again, naming psychoeducation, describing psychoeducation. We have another module which is actually being broadcast tomorrow on fear, stigma, and discrimination, presented by Professors Amy Kapadia and Samantha Winter. We know that interpersonal violence around the world has escalated during this pandemic, and so Professor Louisa Gilbert will speak to that topic. Sleep is certainly one of the things that's been a problem for many, many people under such stressful circumstances, and Professor Carmela Alcantara will talk about that. Professor Susan Whitty, who I believe is in the audience, will be talking about social support, which obviously is critical when we're trying to maintain this kind of distance from each other. And Professor Scheer, Kathy Scheer, who is an expert on loss and grief and complicated grief, will talk about the many forms of grief. Obviously, the overriding one is death and illness, associated with death and illness, but there are also losses associated with everyday structure and transitions and hope and looking forward to something, so she'll be addressing that. Again, we're going to talk about recognition and naming, and then planning, application, outreach, and advocacy is an important part of what the COVID action team is doing. We have a volunteer effort set up on our website, which we're including in the slides at the end of the presentation. We also have an expanding and growing resource list.
Good morning, and thank you, Ellen, for the introduction. And I'm pleased to be here and joining you today to talk a little bit about what we're all of us are going through, and maybe ways to help you cope or help the populations that you work with cope with this. So what are we facing? Definitely social and structural challenges that are coming along with this pandemic and this crisis, one of which is the exponential illness and mortality rates that we have seen that are going and still ongoing. The rippling economic devastation, especially the disproportionate impact on communities of color, which is something that is very concerning and something that we want to address today as well. Exploding unemployment, struggle for survival, economic and food insecurity. Social distancing as a privilege, crowding, noise, multiple demands of parenting, teaching, and maintaining order. I imagine there are people in our audience that are trying to juggle being in the webinar while they might be homeschooling their children as well. Lack of no resources or privilege to work or study remotely. Our student body has moved completely to studying remotely, and it has been a challenge for both the instructors and the students in getting used to this new style of learning. Fear, anxiety, and loss across multiple systems and levels. And we want to emphasize that when we say loss, it's not only loss of life, but loss of the things that we were used to experiencing and doing in an everyday. Increased frustration, interpersonal violence, and conflict, especially when it comes to living together in a confined space for such a long period of time. Ongoing struggle between prioritizing public and economic health, inability to or uneven access to PPE, mask, hand sanitizer, soap, which is an ongoing issue. A stigma and blaming, which is especially, we have heard a lot from our Asian American students in our school, or Asian students, the impact of the stigma that has been carried on. And inconsistent and changing communication and messaging, and that's across the board, from the macro level of politics to the meso level and on micro level too. So we want to address some of those and acknowledge that all of this is happening at the same time.
So on this slide, as we were preparing for this this session, we came across some work by the Mutual Aid Disaster Relief Organization, and their sort of overarching message is that collective care is our best weapon against COVID-19. So to sort of ground what we're doing today, I want to read from their mission statement, which is shown on this slide. So, quote, "Everyone has something to teach and something to share, and we all need assistance at times. We seek to acknowledge, challenge, and subvert perceived and actual power imbalances and use any privileges we have, including access to material resources, freedom of movement, skills, knowledge, experience, and decision-making influence to support people's self-determination and survival in crisis and their long-term resilience afterwards, ultimately bridging the gulf between ourselves and others," quote unquote.
So I wanted to kind of share with you what is psychoeducation and how does it differ from regular education. So psychoeducation provides a collaborative opportunity for both the participant and facilitator to exchange knowledge and learn together about one area of concern. So it's really a collaborative learning process. It creates synergy between education and psychotherapeutic interventions. So by using information, you're also being therapeutic in the sense of providing tools and resiliency and strength to the person that you're working with by knowing what they're going through and being able to name it and handle it. Remove barriers to learning and promotes transformative learning. One of the things that we're going to talk about today is how do we make psychoeducation something that can work for any population, and that's the way you create your module and the way that you create learning. It's setting the stage for that. It's evidence-based and evidence-informed. It has worked very well, especially with individuals who suffer from severe mental illness and trauma. It's principle-based, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. It typically follows a guide or a manual of structure to help kind of move consistently through it. And it identifies practical strategies for coping in face of a challenge. So you not only talk about an issue and sort of therapeutically manage it, but you also work with coping strategies and ways into which to manage it. So we never finish a psychoeducation intervention without kind of assisting the people we're working with to look for ways in which to manage what they're going through. So some critical components, and one of which we're experiencing right now, is present focused. We're making this about COVID-19. It's what we're dealing with. It's what we're going through. So you can easily make it about the present and what people are experiencing. There's flexibility in scheduling. Today, we have a certain amount of time to cover it. We have done psychoeducation interventions that are at the bedside of somebody who's in an ER. And it's very quick because that's the time that you have with a client, or it could be that you do a group that it's an hour and a half long. It's strengths-based perspective, and it's also co-learning and approach. And Ellen said it beautifully at the beginning of today. We usually learn as much from the participants of our psychoeducation workshops or modules than we learn from what we know from literature and our work and our experience. So in some of the theory, go ahead.
I just wanted to add to that. One of the things that one of my students this spring in the psychoeducational class talked about the fact that when people come together, they are thinking together. And I love that way of sort of considering psychoeducation. So people really are co-learning by thinking together.
So some of the theoretical frameworks, and today we don't want to make it so much about that, but we want to give you a little bit of background. It's ecological systems perspective. So the idea of looking at a person in their context, trauma recovery models. A lot of it is based on understanding that, as you know, from a strength-based perspective, we are dealing with a trauma and how to move forward or at least manage it. Narrative interventions, and you're often going to hear us say the phrase bearing witness, the importance of a story and a person's ability to share their story, say it how they feel it, and be able to bear witness to that. Group theory, and we want to sort of clarify, psychoeducation can be done in groups, but it doesn't have to be a group intervention. And so if you're doing it with one person, that's already group theory because it's about learning together and social support and social learning theory. Cognitive behavioral therapy, because as I mentioned before, we want to promote skill-based problem solving and planning, and also motivational interviewing, especially active and reflective listening, which are a major part of that.
So the fundamental principles for psychoeducation include sort of several. The most overarching, most important is the idea of knowledge as power, which emerges from Freire's work in the 1970s and from his book entitled Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And the idea is that as people gain information and gain insight and knowledge, they are more likely to be able to access the resources and support that they need, and also to more effectively advocate for themselves. So it also is, in that sense, also based on clear communication. We emphasize well-being. How do we move toward well-being in the face of trauma or stress? And in this case, with COVID-19, it's very much ongoing stress. And we try to build on individual, family, and community strength and support as a way of building a collaborative or collective community of care. And participants can then take the information that they gain through the workshop or the sessions or whatever it happens to be, and to in turn inform others in the community. So hopefully there's sort of an exponential learning from the experience. We consider cultural relevance and context, including historical traumas and cumulative trauma, which is critically important for many of our populations. And the work builds on principles of social justice and anti-oppressive practice. And finally, we identify and build on individual and collective strengths and hope.
Sorry, there you go.
So when we think about care, collective care or community care, we are thinking about ourselves, of course, and also our family and communities and greater community. In this particular situation, it would seem wise to think about the international community. And then we also think about strategies and ways to improve and sustain health in terms of emotional level, physical level, obviously, relational levels, interpersonal relationships, spiritual levels, and occupational and economic levels. So given what's going on now with so much financial and job insecurity, this is a particularly important area. Psychoeducation supports hope, which is a way of, there's been a lot of interesting thinking and attention to the construct and concept of hope over the last 10 or 15 years. But generally, it's a way of feeling, thinking, and behaving. It's a way of revitalizing and strengthening and thinking about ways to move forward under very difficult situations. And it includes some sense of a positive expectation of the future. And right now, a lot of hopes have been dashed. So one of the ideas behind psychoeducation is to create opportunities for expanding those possibilities and those hopes. And hope is certainly culturally bound. Much of what we talk about actually is culturally bound. And that's another reason why it's so important to promote learning exchange and co-learning. So what are the values that we consider and integrate in psychoeducation? Certainly, and this is a slightly bit repetitive, but these are such important concepts and constructs that we want to return to them. Social justice and an anti-oppressive lens is overarching. The assumption that psychoeducation leads to change and action and awareness and advocacy, back to knowledge is power, that we attend to learning styles. People learn differently and in different ways and at different times. And it's very important to consider that in the context of psychoeducational work. And then we also think about life stage. So we would work very differently with 6-year-olds, with adolescents, and with people in their 70s and 80s if we were implementing some kind of psychoeducational intervention. So the aspects of ourself that are affected through challenges, through major stressors and ongoing trauma and stress are the way we understand and make meaning of our world, of our politics, of our identities, and our spirituality. And for many of us, all of these things have been affected over the last, in completely unexpected ways over the last few months.
I just wanted to share in that point that I am Latina, I am from Puerto Rico, born and raised there, and identity, it's kind of part of how myself has been affected. We're very used to acknowledging everyone with a kiss in the cheek or a hug, and so physical contact and being able to embrace your loved ones, it's something that is very important and has affected me throughout this process. So thinking about how your identity plays into the way that you're coping or not coping, it's something important because it's embedded in who we are, and it's something sometimes we take for granted or not pause to think about or reflect.
And yeah, thanks. And the more that we think about and recognize those changes in ourselves or our world or our interpersonal relationships, the more we can begin to address them.
So how does psychoeducation kind of work? And why do we use it? It builds capacity to take action. The idea is that with information, you're going to be knowledgeable and be able to build capacity. It assists in building awareness, self-determination, identification of resources and strengths. And that's part of the narrative and being able to have a conversation and a dialogue. It exemplifies shared leadership. So ideally, whenever you're doing psychoeducation as an intervention, and that's sort of what we're modeling here today, it's the opportunity to co-facilitate. And the reason is you sort of tag team and work with one another. You need, the eyes in the room to kind of observe reactions when you're bringing up topics, but it also helps so that, for example, one facilitator can pay attention to a particular person that might be triggered in the audience. And it also models this behavior of collaboration with other people. It's exchange of professional lived experience, ideas, skill, knowledge, empathy. And I think it's important that when we're thinking about it as co-facilitators and within the boundaries and ethical constraints of our roles as social workers, for those of you who would be doing this, lived experience in this particular moment in our crisis that we're experiencing, it's everyone. Everyone is going through this. So it is okay to share what you feel comfortable with your audience in regards to lived experience. Cultural humility and literacy, making sure that you know your audience, you understand their culture, you ask questions with respect within boundaries. Clear language and explanation and attention to practical application. Ellen and I have had the experience of working in multiple different areas of practice and also in different countries, and the terminology of some of the words like trauma or words that we often use is not the same, and it's not well taken in some societies. So it's important to pay attention to that. It builds community and social support by nature of being together and by sharing information and coping skills. And it especially highlights stories, voices, and the power of participants. So you want to take a minute, go ahead.
And I just want to emphasize there the importance of the stories, which really, allowing time for stories, whether they're a 30-second story or a 5-minute story in the context of psychoeducation is so critical in terms of allowing space for participants to recognize what they're thinking. Sometimes saying it out loud can be really, really valuable, and having other people attend to that and listen and bear witness. So.
Yeah. So at this moment, we have covered a lot of information, and we wanted to take a pause and ask Anna if she would share with us maybe 1 or 2 questions from the Q&A.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of our audience members wants to know, how is hope connected with resilience? And is hope something that can be taught from a neuroscience framework?
Oh, wow, that's a great question. So I don't know if I can address the question from a neuroscience perspective. I would have to think more about that. However, in terms of moving forward, if you think about the sort of the idea that when hope is cut off, it is really, it restricts the ability for people to reflect on anything beyond the immediate moment. By adding a perspective on hope to our work, and just literally by labeling it, it provides the opportunity for people to sort of open doors and open windows, both for themselves and for the people around them. Does that help? Your question about neuroscience is actually a fascinating one. However, I don't feel prepared to answer that on the spot.
I also would add that I think hope is sort of an initial step, feeling emotion that helps you in your way to resiliency. And Ella and I had kind of a lot of back and forth, because resiliency, it's a word that carries a lot of power with it. And in this particular moment, we feel that resiliency may look very different to many different people. And then we don't want to put that pressure of what does it mean to be resilient. It can be small stages, baby steps, but I think hope is sort of the beginning of that. If you're hopeful, if you have something to look forward to, and if you feel supported, that is the beginning of a process that could continue with resiliency. Any other questions, Anna?
We do. So somebody else wants to know, how does psychoed intervention work online? Sort of thinking what this looks like in our virtual world right now.
That's a great question. So I think in a way it molds really well to telehealth and working online, because of the structure of a module. So you will be having, and we'll go into a little bit of the detail of how to create a psychoeducation intervention, but you have things defined like timing, the topic, sort of the order in which things are presented, the participation of people would be sort of a back and forth. Today, we're not having so much back and forth because of the amount of people that are joining us, but in a smaller group, it's feasible that people will be on their mic and contribute questions and answer questions and share their experiences. So I think it is actually it can be a telehealth mechanism to help others.
And just to add to that, and we also will need to consider sort of confidentiality and ethical issues associated with this moving forward. So there are two sides that seems to have tremendous potential, and there are many things we need to consider.
Do we want one more question, Anna?
Sure. So we have a question from the chat box of how does psychoed approaches differ per age group?
Oh, that's a great question. So one of the things that we attend to very carefully in psychoeducational models has to do with language translation and literacy. So we would need to explain something about hope, for example, or community in very different words with 6-year-olds than we would with elders who've lived a very long time and pretty much have experienced a sense of those things, or hopefully. So it really just depends on how, and also it would have to do with the pacing, the amount of content, the time length for the session. There would be multiple things you would have to consider.
Okay, we're going to continue with Q&A throughout the presentation, and then I will keep track of your questions, so we'll go back into them in a little bit. So how do we build connections? The idea of psychoed, it's through presence, the person and how the person is experienced by the other, the spirit or feeling or the atmosphere that you create in a psychoeducation intervention. It's extremely important. And this goes back to that exchange. Oftentimes when I have done psychoeducation work, I see that it not so much as the facilitator, but the interactions among the group members, it makes a big difference in how they view their experience by hearing somebody else and sharing their experience. Communication, listening and connecting through words and body language. Body language is an important part of that, and that's why co-facilitation is really important, so that you're keenly aware of what's going on in the atmosphere of the room. Being okay with silence, which sometimes we're very uncomfortable with. But I have learned that it's a very powerful process, and especially when people are going through crisis or traumatic experiences, it's something that has to be held in the space. People participate in different ways. Some people will share a lot, some people will share very little, and that's okay. There's not really a marker of how much people should share. Power, position, privilege, and race are a part of it. Who are we in society, in the world, and what we represent comes into play for everyone in the room, not only for the participants. And who is in the room? What are their stories, where they come from, how are they feeling in that moment? And so being very self-aware as a facilitator and a member of that community that you're joining, of what's happening in your surroundings.
And I just wanted to add one more thing, Yamile, that I think is so important in terms of the communication piece. That it's okay not to know. When the facilitator is, or somebody in the audience is, or the group is trying to ask a question that people can't really answer, it's better to acknowledge that and then come back to it. So.
Yeah. So psychoeducation is a process where we ideally build vicarious strength and perspective from one another. We already talked a little bit about hope today, but the idea is to instill hope and create hope within the community that you're working with. Also finding meaning. And I think a little bit of what we're going to try to do in our sample session today, it's sort of being helpful in trying to name and find meaning in the experience that each of us is having with COVID-19. Recognition of patterns, anticipation of triggers, and mitigation. We really want to be keen to thinking about what are things that for the audience that we're working with might be triggering or might affect them, and try to mitigate that and help them navigate through it. And building a community of care with perspective and advocacy. And when we say advocacy, it can be everything from a bigger advocacy, but also advocacy among each other. If you're working with a particular small community or an individual and they need services, and helping them navigate how do they get those services, where do they call, and what is the first step that they take. Something as small as that, it is advocacy in itself. So the overarching question, it's how do we accomplish goals of psychoeducation? And that requires attention to facilitators, barriers. So we wanna make sure that the facilitators are well aware of what's going on with the people that they're working with. Sometimes, as Ellen said, pushing too much something, it's not the right thing, so letting it be. Involves shared language and understanding, making sure that what terminology you use is one that people can relate to and navigate through. And that also promotes shared knowledge, which is professional knowledge and experiential knowledge. And especially respect and humility about the things that you don't know and the things that you might know, but are coming from a very unique experience of who you are. Time is important to consider. Everyone has somewhere to be and somewhere to go, so it's important to stick to time and to frame it in a way that you're timing yourself. Attention, as Ellen said, to confidentiality, willingness, and accessibility to share, and involves education about processes of mental health and health literacy. So especially in times where we don't necessarily know how to name the experiences that we're going through, it's helping people navigate and understanding those concepts. So what do we consider when we are doing a session? We consider timing, we consider content. So we usually start with talking about, for example, trauma and what that might be, according to what we know as facilitators, but also experiences that we have had. And we usually do that with a framework of asking questions like who goes through it, what is it, when does it happen, where does it happen, why does it happen, and how does it happen? And those questions lead to a conversation that allows the audience to kind of share their own experiences. We usually start and end with either a mindfulness or grounding exercise. The reason is to sort of calm the room and really focus on the conversation ahead. Recognizing patterns of stress and how the stress manifests for the people that we're working with, and looking at context in terms of power and privilege. And I think even for today, when we were working on this for you, we were very keenly aware of like the power and privilege that we have to sit today and be able to do a workshop while other people are working in the front lines and don't have the time or ability to do so. So it's something that it's really important to always have in the back of our minds, and I speak about it openly.
And then I just wanted to add that the questions who, what, when, where, why, and how are also so important in thinking through what one is trying to do with a psychoeducational intervention. So we can use them within those questions within the sessions, but also as we think about what are we trying to do with this particular session or this particular series of sessions or this 10 minutes with somebody in the ER. So those are critical. For me, they've really helped me to conceptualize clinical and community practice over the years. So in order to ground our work, when we start with a psychoeducational group, we strongly suggest creating some kind of a community agreements to ground the learning exchange. And typically we go back to those agreements at the beginning of every session. We review them at every session. And that really helps both the participants and the facilitators to understand and agree to sort of the parameters for communication among participants. So I've done a lot of work with folks with severe mental illness using psychoeducational interventions, and it was really helpful to have agreements at the beginning so that the people who were struggling with their symptoms would sort of know what to expect, and it would be okay for the facilitators to gently remind them of that. If we don't have agreements, it's difficult to do that. So the most basic ones, and that these certainly could be explained or expanded or changed based on whatever who's in the group or what the purpose is. The most basic are respect and humility, as we've talked about before, openness, encouraging people to be as open as they feel comfortable being, to encourage participation and to recognize that participation can be very different for different people. So someone might be utterly engaged in the process, but because of a history of shyness, they have trouble talking. So it's really important for the facilitators to recognize that and to find ways to support people who are participating in very different ways. We also find that there are people who like to hog the room, as it were, and we have to figure out ways to gently limit that so that other people have a chance to speak, which then leads, of course, into the importance of the exchange and allowing time for and really facilitating an exchange among the people in the room. and throughout to build support. Again, going back to one of our theoretical foundations, social support theory is really important, and social learning theory, that people learn together in really unique and creative ways. So the overarching structure for the psychoeducational groups, we're talking about groups here. As Yamile said earlier, this can easily be done one-on-one with following the exact same principles. That it's just, it sort of expands, from my perspective, expands the value when working in a group because of the opportunities for social support and exchange. Typically co-facilitated, although again, that does not have to happen. And psychoeducation has been set up with a workshop format with the educational content being presented at the very beginning of the series, and then with focused discussion and questions during the series, or with curriculum modules, which is what we are modeling today. And then process, to me, this is what makes psychoeducation so fascinating, that we typically start with a curriculum manual. However, the process never follows the manual. So you have to be really willing and able to be flexible and to work in the moment, because otherwise you will be endlessly frustrated because your modules you don't get through your module, or you have to change direction in the middle, or somebody is triggered for whatever reason and you have to attend to that, which another reason why it's very valuable to have a co-facilitator. And then the importance of very active engagement and use of self. This requires, to me, this is why it makes it so interesting to me, that you have to be exceedingly present in a group like this or in a session like this, because it's important to use yourself. This is the old mandate from social work of practice wisdom. And then always returning to the importance of social justice and humility. And one of the ways that we've thought about psychoeducation that has been really, really helpful to us is to change some of the questions that we ask people in the context of psychoeducational work. So again, and these are questions that are also a way of addressing and encouraging hope and being able to identify strengths. So changing the question from what is the problem to instead, what is the story? Or changing the question from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. And this really allows space to think about our work from an ecological systems perspective, from an historical perspective, and to really better understand the impact of trauma and stress.
And just to add, I think it takes away the stigma of having a problem or having a challenge, and just really talking about it rather than being labeled as, a patient or somebody who has a challenging situation. It's really about their experience, not about a label.
And this is a slide that really speaks to the value of the exchange between the facilitator and the participant. So we as social workers bring our body of professional knowledge. We also certainly have experiential knowledge, and in this particular COVID-19 pandemic, we all have experiential knowledge. Nobody is excused. At any rate, we bring our professional knowledge from having gone to social work school, from working in the field, and based on that, we know about external patterns of stress and coping. We know about crisis and stress management. We've learned through supervision and through our own interactions about the importance of modeling communication skills, or I statements, or other forms of communicating with each other. And we know about common response patterns, what the typical responses are to stress, which actually we'll talk about a bit later. And the participants bring their own major contributions. They bring the lived experience, the everyday or experiential knowledge, that no matter how much professional knowledge we have not lived what they've lived. They bring awareness, and we can work with them to identify individual strengths. And with some recognition, they can begin to become aware of the patterns and subtle changes that have happened in their lives based on the stressors that they've encountered, and they can bring that to the psychoeducational process. They also have the continuity of interest and the ongoing, hopefully, ongoing support from family and friends, although not necessarily, but they bring their own self-interest, and we come and go as professionals. We're not there all the time. So it's really important to recognize and work with people to help them identify and build on strengths. And then again, with recognition and labeling and naming, we can help people to identify cues and triggers and the structures that are really the structures that help ground their lives. So I know for myself, one of the things I've really missed over the last, and here I'm talking as a participant, one of the things that I've really sorely missed over the last couple of months is my walk to Columbia School of Social Work in the morning, which takes about 25 minutes. And I really think of it as my time out during the day. So walking between the bedroom and the kitchen just doesn't quite cut it.
Yeah.
And then the interactive feedback, which is the interaction between the participants and the facilitators, and among the participants. What we've seen in groups in the past, which I find fascinating, is that somebody will say something, another group member will say something to somebody they've just met who's been sort of floundering with an issue for a long time, and just because a peer said it, they were able to step back and to have a critical aha moment. So a lot of light bulbs go on in the psychoeducational process. And so just to elaborate on that, we think of psychoeducation as a collaborative model, moving away, shifting a paradigm from the expert, the professional expert, to the client, and really emphasizing that participants and facilitators all serve as educators, as students, as translators of thoughts and language and cultural constructs, as consultants, as facilitators, and this actually can be built into some of the agreements for a group, as advocates for each other. I've seen situations where group members really go to bat for other group members, which is a really powerful phenomenon to watch, both inside and outside the group, and also to monitor and give feedback on the process.
So how do we think about mental health in the context of psychoeducation and COVID-19? And we want to use this question sort of for you to either chat in the chat box or in the Q&A in terms of your thoughts about it, and we'll go back to it in a little bit. But I think it's important to think about how can we use this tool within COVID-19. So when we talk about mental health as flourishing, we talk about emotional well-being, the idea of positive affect, or about quality of life. We also talk about psychological well-being, self-acceptance, personal growth, purpose in life, environmental mastery, autonomy, or positive relationship with others. And when we talk about social well-being and flourishing, we talk about acceptance, actualization, contribution, coherence, and integration. And we're very self-aware, Ellen and I, that this is an ideal. I think most people are in mental health in progress, and so they might have some aspect of emotional well-being while they don't have aspects of social well-being. And for all of us, I think I talk collectively, some aspect of either emotional, psychological, or social well-being, or all of them have been affected by this crisis. And so being aware of how they have happened and how they have manifested in your particular persona, it's incredibly important. And it's the awareness that leads to maybe receiving and accepting help, or just being able to talk through it and manage it. Some of the trauma symptoms that we often see that have to do with also how our mental health or health is being affected. It's affective, the way that our affect shows and we relate to others. our behavior can change, and there's also cognitive changes. Somebody I saw in the audience talked about the importance of, if you do psychoeducation online, the amount of time. And I think I probably other people feel like me, where I don't have the same attention span or the same concentration. Some people are using the phrase, I'm Zoom out. I spend too much time on Zoom today. So even our cognitions, our ability to concentrate, our ability to give attention to a task has been affected. And so being very well self-aware of this is important. Some general types of emotional stress injury that we talk about are trauma, acute stress disorder or PTSD, long-term hyperarousal, dissociation, damage to our belief system. We also talk about fatigue, wear and tear injury, cumulative stress. One of the ways that we talk about it is talking about depression, generalized anxiety or panic, and concepts that happen in Civil War, World War II, like soldier's heart or shell shock or battle fatigue, literally fatigue about being sort of in this constant crisis mode. And also grief and loss, the preoccupation, nightmare, sleep disturbance. And in these concepts, we want to really make sure that we don't take them as DSM concepts, but as human concepts that we can have some signals of depression and some anxiety because of the unknown, or we don't know when we're going to be, until when we're going to be in lockdown. And it's okay to talk about them that way. I think highly stigmatized concepts of mental health don't help. And so that's why language is so important in psychoeducation. We can talk about fatigue, and fatigue doesn't necessarily have a connotation of an illness or a condition. And so we want to make these concepts generalized enough and relatable enough for the audience and for ourselves to feel comfortable talking about them.
And I'm so struck by the word shock, because I had a similar reaction after September 11th for the first week, 10 days, 2 weeks, as I had similar, this kind of the same reaction after we were sort of sent home from work now 6 or 7 weeks ago. For the first week, I could not focus. I felt like it was a lost week. I couldn't concentrate on anything. I felt like a turtle moving from one thing to another. And I think that is a form of emotional shock. They talked about shell shock after World War II among soldiers, which I understand went on for maybe many years. So there are many forms of shock, but I just think it's important to recognize that. So.
Yeah. So some possible features that you would see are damage to our belief system. Things are no longer what we thought they were, or that what we believed they were, and how that affects us. Hyperarousal, shame and guilt, and damage to self-esteem. It's really hard to say I'm struggling. It's really hard because we also are comparing ourselves with people who might seem that they're handling it well. And so that's one thing that it's important to sort of accept where you are in the process and not necessarily compare and contrast. And that also can have an impact on your ability to feel anger, fear, anxiety, irritability. We know as human beings that uncertainty is something that really creates a lot of anxiety, and we are sort of living in a constant uncertain time right now. Immobilization, I certainly have felt that, inability to feel like, we can do something, or we can help other people, or we can do a significant contribution in this process, and you feel kind of immobilized and paralyzed. Personality changes. Some people have, short fuse, and those are becoming more evident, and even personality changes from people who are usually smiling all the time and they don't smile as much. So it can vary in how it looks. And also something that I think will probably resonate with many of you, it's isolation and loneliness. The idea of being locked down, of not having our social connectiveness, whatever that will mean to you. And also within a cultural perspective, which I shared early on, creates a lot of isolation and loneliness.
So to think about how to counteract both the individual and the systemic effects of cumulative stress and trauma, this again comes from trauma and recovery theory. So the whole idea of creating a sense of belonging, which is one of the efforts we would make in a psychoeducational group, to create a sense of safety. Safety is a loaded term. However, in the context of group process, setting up a structure where there is confidentiality and people feel okay about talking and sharing their ideas, it becomes pretty critical in that particular sense. Communication and increasing and build, well, communication. We've seen a lot of inconsistency in communication over the last months. So within our psychoeducational framework, we really strive for openness and consistency of messaging. And then to bring together people to increase their participation in their communities and in their own lives and with their families, and to build a sense of citizenship. I don't know about that word, but at any rate, and then also to build a sense of self-agency, of self-efficacy, and personal power. And this also is a quote from Sandra Bloom's work in her book, Bearing Witness, Violence and Social Responsibility. She's done a lot of work on what she refers to as creating sanctuary as a way to create healing and lead to healing. And the quote that I really like, or we really like from her book, is the establishment of safety is the starting point for all efforts at healing. So how do we begin to work during this ongoing crisis? And that's actually a really important question, because timing is very critical in terms of psychoeducation. It's really important to think about these constructs now. However, it may not be the time when people can use them, just because they're in the midst of this ongoing crisis. It is not over. So how do we think about safety in the face of an ongoing crisis, stress, and trauma? That's really an open question that we need to continue to think about. We want to think about affect, how people work with themselves and how they bear witness to each other and themselves through shared stories. It goes back to the importance of narratives and exchange. Obviously, we attend to grief and loss, which is an ongoing process and will continue to be an ongoing process, and to physical reaction. So it's really critical in a psychoeducational group to think about body language and to help people to understand the mind-body connection. We've talked, I think, about advocacy and planning, how psychoeducation can lead to that and how it can help people to recognize their own patterns, which is a critical aspect of planning, and to help people make some meaning out of this bizarre and strange and unprecedented experience. Perhaps attending to the fact that the environment has improved a bit under the circumstances, but thinking about ways that we can create hope in the midst of this ongoing, basically, tragedy. And then to think about individual and as well as collective coping. So we have a question for you. Any thoughts or questions so far? Let's reflect together and we'll take a few questions.
Anna?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you spoke earlier about how pretty much all facets of this work are culturally grounded. And I've been seeing in the chat that that's really resonated with a lot of people, and they've been commenting on how they see that reflected in their work. So Joanne wanted to know if you could speak a bit about how psychoed has been received across cultures.
So that's a great question. I think one of the, thanks Joanne, I think one of the most important aspects of psychoeducation is psychoeducation about psychoeducation. So helping people to understand the framework and the process. And obviously that has to be translated culturally. So for example, as Yamile said earlier, people understand the concept and constructs of trauma and stress very, very differently in different cultures. Some think that it's a sort of the experience of tragedy is foreordained, for example. Other people understand it in very, very different ways. So taking the basic framework and adapting and adjusting that both in terms of language literally and also in terms of cultural translation becomes fundamental. And it really involves a collaboration between people in the community and outside the community, with a strong emphasis on people from within the community. So timing and attention to planning becomes really critical.
Yeah, I would add to that also the structure of the session in terms of how do you feel the room? So one of the things that psychoeducation is very big about, it's kind of breaking the hierarchy and the power structure. And so making sure that, if you can sit in a circle or sit with a person and it's a conversation, it sort of, breaks down that idea of barriers and allows culture to express itself in a more normal and easy way. And I also think that if you, as a facilitator, learn about the culture, if you don't know things, ask them. If you want to find out things, do so that you can know, for example, if at a certain culture, a certain tradition is important, a certain religious belief is important, you can incorporate that into the session and make sure that you're being culturally humble about it and also integrate it in the work that you do.
In work that I was involved in after September 11th with the Chinese American community in Lower Manhattan, there was some initial resistance to the idea of groups. And after some back and forth and discussion, we decided at least we would try it. We would try a group, psychoeducational group process. And it took some time, but then people really became quite invested in it. So it really does. We really need to think about and consider the perspective of the participants and the culture.
Mm-hmm. Anna, any others?
Thank you. Yeah, so Amy was commenting on how use of self can be really tricky and challenging in our work when we're thinking of, how much to share and when, and commented that our facilitators are modeling this very beautifully and naturally for us. And then one of our audience members asks, can you speak more about self-disclosure in psychoeducation, as there are so many perspectives as to how much social workers should or shouldn't share, particularly as we don't want to shift the focus to clients worrying about the social worker?
Mm-hmm. That's a beautiful question. The way I think about, and Yamile, I'm sure you want to add to this, the way I think about boundaries in the context of social psychoeducation is loosening boundaries to a point in the service of the work. So you're right, the person who asked the question is right. We don't want to ask or invite the participants to start worrying about us. On the other hand, there are experiences that we've had that can also be helpful in providing insight for participants. And they're often, certainly now, there are common elements of this practice. Common elements of this experience with COVID-19 that would be important to share.
Yeah, and I would add to that it's also very personal. You have to be okay with what you share, knowing that your audience might take it in different ways. And so whatever you share, it's something that you would be comfortable if people might interpret it a little bit different because you are with other people and their understanding of your experience might be different. So for example, if I would share with you that my sleep is not great, I'm okay sharing that and you might take it any way you want. But because I also feel comfortable that I'm probably not alone when I say that. So I think it's a level of comfort, and it's also if you have a conscious effort of using your self-disclosure for the purpose of enhancing and bettering the group dynamic or the individual dynamic. So it can create empathy, it can create rapport, it can create support. So as long as that's the intention behind it and you feel comfortable with sharing, I think that's purposeful and useful for everyone.
Wonderful.
Maybe one more question.
Yeah, a really great question, I think, is how I just lost it. How would psychoeducation for healthcare professionals differ for that geared towards our clients as we're all trying to overcome the pandemic, considering that many healthcare professionals are not only experiencing the pandemic of COVID-19, but also those that are on the front line? How might those two approaches differ?
So we often do psychoeducation to train the trainers, sort of a little bit of what we're doing today in that sense. But we also work with other populations that are that need the support and the help. And I think part of it is that's the beauty of psychoed, that you kind of form it for the population that you have in front of you. So obviously for essential workers or doctors, nurses, anybody who works in an emergency situation right now, could benefit from something like this, and acknowledging that their realities may be very different than people who are not in the front lines, and what does that look like, allowing space for sharing that. Also the fears that they might have, the stigma that they might be going through, are things that you can accommodate by doing a session for them. So that is sort of why we pick psychoeducation as the intervention to share with you, because you really can mold it to the population you're working with. Ellen, I don't know if you want to add anything there.
No, that's great.
Okay. So we want to continue just giving you a little bit more information on the possible structure for a psychoeducation session. So we always start with a welcome and what is psychoeducation, an explanation of the process so that people know what they're getting into and understanding a little bit more. The community agreements that Ellen shared, and you can always start with a couple of them, and in my experience, people add to them based on the group, on the dynamics, on the particular population that you're working with. We start and end with a mindfulness or grounding exercise. We talk about critical psychoeducational context and exchange. So for example, today we're talking about stress and coping, trauma's response. In other sessions, you will talk about grief and loss, support, stigma. And the way we do that is by using some prompts and just information about sharing that content and prompting questions from the audience. And that's where the shared narrative and stories happen, the co-learning process. Ideally after that, we talk about problem solving or other skills and components. And many times that comes out of the conversation of the narrative stories, because people share how they have dealt with it and what has worked or not, and what barriers have they found. We go back to some mindfulness or grounding exercise, and then we make sure to wrap up and do a reflection exercise to sort of summarize. Usually in a session, a lot of things happen, and it's good to bring it to a conclusion and kind of share what happened in the room with everyone else.
And obviously the length of the session really depends on the participants. So yeah, you might have a much shorter session with a group of 10-year-olds than you would with a group of people in their 50s, for example, or something like that. So. And
when we talk about timing, it can be everything from the length of the session to the ability of, maybe taking more time for mindfulness and grounding, because we see that our particular group of people that we're working with need to be helped in that sense, or maybe allowing a little bit more room for share stories. So timing works also, as much as we structure it, it works with what happens in the moment in the present focus. So that's something to always consider. So what are we doing next? We are going to try to work through a brief session on naming and coping with COVID-19 for all of us. And we want you to think about and have in the back of your mind privilege. Obviously, coping and naming this for everyone in the audience and outside of the audience is very different. And so we want to acknowledge that there's privilege in the way that we can be talking about it today. Possible triggers. This is a very difficult situation that we're all going through. So if at any moment you feel that talking about these issues is triggering, please take a little break, take a walk, whatever it's needed. And then also just taking into account that there's a concept of universality about this. Everyone is having a hard time, and everyone is coping in different ways. And this is sort of a global reality that we're going through. And so understanding that you're not alone in the process, I think and it brings strength into it too.
So as Yamile said, we're going to sort of talk you through, sort of give an example of a session. And so for this particular mini session, our goal is to build strength and safety by naming the experience, to build awareness and increase insight. And we typically have sort of notes to ourselves. Yamile just talked about timing and it's really important to be sensitive to the group's energy and mood as we prepare to discuss stress and trauma reactions. And it might be really important to hold a moment of silence in honor of participant experiences, again, depending on what's happening in the room or what your sense is. And we thought to model that, we would take a few seconds now, probably 10 seconds, and Yamile is going to time us for a moment of silence in honor of our own experiences and those of our greater community and world.
Okay.
So thanks.
Thank you.
So we would start with defining and beginning to define community trauma, and just quickly that these are events or circumstances, and this wouldn't necessarily be quick in an actual session, but because of limited time here, the circumstances, brief or ongoing, that threaten a community's existence, purpose, focus, or goal. May involve, and in the current case certainly has involved, the death of community members. We could talk about how community trauma relates to individual and family trauma. We could talk about aspects of food insecurity and unemployment and the associated fear. And right now, there's a lot of community stress and trauma simply around what's unknown. And part of this would be to talk about, and these are the unique and common challenges among participants, having to do with grief and loss. We've talked about that, and as I said earlier, Professor Scheer will do a whole session on that. Stigma, discrimination, and racism are front and center right now on many, many levels. Anger and violence are increasing. What I was just reading in the Times this morning is that sort of interpersonal anger on the street, as we've been sheltering in place, has increased a bit or quite a lot in the last week or so. The lack of resources and support. And as we talked about it earlier, as Yamile talked about earlier, the critical impact of loneliness and isolation. And then we would go on to try to identify some of the unique strengths of our participants, their shared traditions and values, the importance of collectivism, particularly right now, in terms of prioritizing the interests of the group over our own goals. So why it's so important to shelter in place for now. And as we keep returning to the cultural component and diversity in the room. So here we want to take some time. We're aware that we're close to the end of this session, but we want to take some time to name the experiences, for you to name the experiences in the time of COVID-19. So how do you, your family, your community define what's going on with COVID-19? Can you define it? We think that's a really important question. Can you define it? So, can you describe feelings and reactions? And how can we think about this together?
So we're going to talk a little bit, and we want you to maybe share in the question and answer some of the answers to those questions that Ellen just made, if you feel comfortable with those. On the second part of this, we want to talk about stress and trauma reactions at the personal, familial, and community level. Some typical reactions to stress and trauma that you might have heard of are people react to stress in many ways. So that includes physical, emotional, mental, behavioral, and spiritual ways. And sometimes we don't realize that what is happening to us is a common or typical reaction of stress. So we thought of sharing with you some common signs and signals of a stress reaction. Body fatigue and insomnia, difficulty breathing, intestinal upset are part of the things that happen to your body when you're highly stressed. In your mind, the tendency to blame others, increase or decrease awareness of your surroundings, suicidal thoughts or ideas, disbelief and changing values. In terms of your feelings, it can be everything from anxiety, loss of your emotional control, or feelings of worthlessness, apathy, or boredom. Actions, change in your normal activities. I think that's probably one that everyone is experiencing at this time and getting used to that, the new normal. Emotional outbursts, inability to rest or to rest your mind. And then spiritually, loss of sense of meaning or loss of optimism or hope. And part of what it's important is to acknowledge that some of these are more than normal and expected at a time of crisis, your self-awareness of them helps you sort of be able to, okay, acknowledge I'm not sleeping, maybe I need to do something to help myself get there, because it's important for my health and my physical health as well. So in the idea of coping, how do we survive and keep on going after a community trauma? Part of surviving includes confronting the adversity. And when we say this, we don't speak in absolute terms, we speak in whatever that will be for you here today. Caring for yourself, your family, and community. And that could be everything from getting off your PJs and being able to take a shower to being able to cook a wonderful dinner, or not snapping because you had a long day. So it's small steps, finding meaning that it's comforting and strengthening. So a lot of people go into creativity, arts, music, dance, movement, that one walk a day that you take out of the 23 hours that you're on lockdown, if you can do that. Personal and community advocacy. So how do you engage with others in your community? And the ability of a community to keep on going is something that we have to think about, and that it's a hopeful thought that helps us cope, that there's going to be sort of light at the end of the tunnel. And in terms of more on coping, when we say addressing adversity, I think it's recognizing strengths and possibility. Right now, a lot of people are thinking about the ability of their jobs to be secure or not. So things like being able to ask for help or applying for unemployment, or thinking about what your employment will look like if you have a small business and then accessing a small business loan. Care for self, for your family and community, which could promote your well-being, but also recognizing tiny successes and pleasures. For some families right now, that means identifying a food bank because they don't have enough food to go on, or being able to care for themselves emotionally or physically. And then finding meaning that it's comforting and strengthening in terms of being in nature, or practicing your faith, or saying a prayer, or meditating for 1 minute, or closing your eyes and taking a nap if you can afford to do that. So we recognize that many coping skills here, some of which are more privileged than others are basic necessities that need to be met. So we're very cognizant that at this time coping might look very differently for many different people. So we just wanted to have a moment to maybe get a couple of your comments on stress reactions and what people are going through. Anna?
Yeah, absolutely. So I know Amy commented that these experiences are so difficult and different, and what helps me is keeping in mind the collective experience. Truly, we are and have to be in this together, and we need to consider the tremendous impact on those of us who are especially vulnerable, and or those of us who experience everyday, ongoing, systematic oppression. So I thought that was a really, really powerful contribution. Tony also is reflecting on some of the voices that are going unaddressed. So there's a lot of very warranted attention on the frontline medical workers, but there are some folks that feel that those are people with real issues. By comparison, mine are unimportant. And so their issues and their experiences are going unaddressed.
And I think that's a very important point that we sort of try to put in here in terms of coping and reactions. And social workers are essential workers, the people who are delivering our groceries, the people who are delivering our packages. And so part of coping for me, I can share with the audience, is in New York, at least for those of those of you who live in New York, that 7 o'clock applaud to our essential workers, which for me are a very large number of people. It gives me sort of a sense of community. Everyone does it, everyone is kind of engaged in it, and also helps me cope because it's something I'm looking forward to every day. And so I think it's very important. And also when we talk about the different people who are affected by it, it's not only the people who are working right now, but also those that now don't have work and don't have food and are struggling, or the ones that are ill, or the many elderly individuals, or people who have the condition and are alone, which is very, very difficult for them and for their families.
And to add to this, this crisis is ongoing, and it will continue to be ongoing for a long time after we come up with some vaccine or whatever the next step is. And in the work that I was involved in after September 11th with a number of colleagues, we found that timing that there was a time for the psychoeducation, and that time went on for quite a long number of years. So people were not necessarily ready to take in this kind of information right in the midst of their immediate reactions. However, as things began to sort of come back a bit back to center, then it was the time to implement this kind of practice. So it's really important to anticipate and begin to think about these things now. And then there are many, many questions as to how this would be implemented and when. So some possible examples, and thanks for those great comments and questions. Some possible examples of grounding or mindfulness exercises. I'm sure probably almost everyone in the audience is familiar with the idea of progressive relaxation, the technique of, and this works very well with some groups and not so well with others. But the idea of allowing yourself to relax and breathe, starting with and focusing on your toes and moving up through your abdomen and through your neck and head. There are various breathing exercises that are very, very useful for and can be done relatively quickly, teaching people the idea of square breathing or box breathing, to breathe in on the count of 4, hold for the count of 4, breathe out on the count of 4, and hold for the count of 4, and to repeat that several times. People find that very soothing for anxiety. Belly breathing and focusing on belly breathing with counting. It's an important aspect of cognitive behavioral techniques. And then there's a really nice focused mindfulness and grounding exercise, the 5-4-3-2-1 exercise, where you focus on, you just sit quietly and focus on the 5 senses. So the five, for example, 5 colors in the room, 4 things that you can feel, 3 things that you can taste. That doesn't always work, and etc. So the 5-4-3-2-1 exercise is a very calming exercise for people. And then Yamile and I had a really wonderful exercise that we used in a group with young women who were adolescents. We used a meditation bell at the beginning and end of each session. And these young women were completely mesmerized by this bell, and they asked for us to repeat it. So we not only started the groups and ended the groups with the meditation bell, but we did the meditation bell more than twice or more than once at the beginning of each group. So that was another just wonderful example. And I'm sure there are other examples from all of you that would be really helpful and really add to the richness of this approach. And then we wanted to just think about, we love this sense of healing from the Native American traditions, thinking about healing in the 4 directions: the spiritual, the community, the environment, it's been particularly important now, and the self. So again, the spiritual, the community, the environment, and the self as healing in the 4 directions. And so to summarize, we emphasize the importance of a learning exchange, of resources, of trading resources and ideas and information and knowledge. That our work of psychoeducation is a time to think and reflect together. We said that earlier. It's an opportunity for participants to build what we like to refer to as a resource portfolio or backpack. These are images that help think about what's there that helps you to move toward, to build your strengths. We aim for a strengths perspective, for a social justice and anti-oppressive lens, which certainly is an ongoing effort. That's something that we constantly attend to. And for empathy, generosity, and dignity. We haven't really talked about dignity, but that's an important aspect of humility and respect, and building connection. And then again, building toward collective care and advocacy.
So we have talked a lot and shared with you a little bit about how psychoeducation works, how do you structure it, and just went through a very small session with you. but wanted to know and just open it up to how do you, your family, your community continue to cope and keep on going. If you want to share some ideas and let us know. And also, have you found a meaning for this crisis that brings you comfort or strength, which is something very challenging to do, especially when you're in the midst of it. But I know some people have shared with me in my personal circle how this has really made them think about sort of ways of finding meaning and changing ways that they thought or acted before. So Anna, would you want to open the floor to maybe some questions at this time and discussion and exchange?
We're almost out of time too.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have so many good questions and so many good comments. So thank you, everybody who's been participating in that way. So Candace spoke about the importance of rephrasing or reframing the experience and uses the term like cocooning. So the idea of change and growth during this period of rest or pause is really helping her cope. And then many are sharing different coping mechanisms that they found to be helpful through healing, such as journaling, dreams, and a meditation bell or sound bowl. Some have created a wellness room in middle schools. And I just think it's really wonderful to see how everybody is learning to cope in different ways. One question that I think is really interesting to kind of end on is, what does this look like moving forward, right? So how does psychoeducation help us move towards collective action or collective healing?
That's such a wonderful question, and I think we partly address that by thinking that we're in the midst of this crisis, and so it's an ongoing process, and we are certainly learning together. As we emphasized at the beginning, this is something that none of us have really experienced in any way before. So just allowing ourselves to answer that question, I think, becomes a really important part of this process.
I also think that it kind of will be an ongoing new reality. Many people have shared that phrase of this is the new normal, whatever normal might mean to people. And I think that's why this work is so important, because at some point, one session of psychoeducation obviously will not be enough, and it's an ongoing process of sharing information, sharing experiences as society and the new normal begins to kick in. So I think being able to do that and taking small steps and being able to name things it's very important. And that's sort of what we wanted to try to do today, to set a stage for you to be able to do it even in your own lives and also do it with the people you work with. Any other questions, Anna, that you think we should address?
I think we have so many different questions that I wish we had time to get to, but I think that really is a good place to end with a lot of these questions. And just as a note that from all of our audience members, we have a resounding thank you to both of our presenters for all of the knowledge that you're sharing. So thank you for taking this time.
So I just, before we go into a little bit of thank you, just want to say, from both Ellen and I, stay healthy and stay well as much as you can. And again, take little steps, because I think that makes a big difference.
And we are, I think we're open to staying on for a half an hour more if people, just to have an open discussion, right? But for those who must leave now, thank you to, first of all of you. It's been such a, it has been great. To members of the COVID-19 action team at CSSW, who've been such a wonderful team to work with. And the website for this is shown here on the slide, and we will distribute the slides. Thank you to Tiffany and the Office of Professional Excellence for all your background and work and ongoing support. And to Anna Balakrishnan for your energy and technical support and for fielding all those questions. And finally, in honor of all the providers, first responders, essential workers, and all the people struggling and to survive and cope in this unprecedented time. So thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you.
And I'm just gonna let you know too, we have a couple of folks who have their hand raised. So in this time too, if you guys want to open up for people to come off mic as well, we can do that for sure. Still.
Sure, that's great.
For sure.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We have Faye. You have your hand raised, and we're going to go ahead and unmute your mic. Well, I should clarify, Faye, if you're still on, I just gave you permission to mute your mic, so, but the platform allows you to mute yourself now. We wanted to let you know. Okay. All right, I'm going to also open it up for Kelly as well. All right, Kelly, I see you lowered your hand, so we'll go ahead. All right, Alexandria, I'm sorry if it's pronouncing your name.
Thanks, Tiffany. Thank you all for your time. I just was wondering, I'm currently still interning at my placement with the IRC, trying to create backpacks, if you will, for resources for caseworkers who are supporting clients in COVID, but also being aware of caseworker needs. And I keep coming across this difficulty in striking a balance between providing as many resources to fit all the possible hypothetical situations, from domestic violence to substance abuse and everything that comes with, in addition to a refugee experience, but also just realizing that there's an overwhelming feeling that comes with having so many resources. And I'm wondering if anyone has thoughts around, and this presentation was so valuable, but I'm just trying to figure out better ways to package information to make it accessible, usable, and most importantly, like, have an underlying encouragement or motivation and simplicity. And so I'm really struggling to find a balance between that. And I was wondering if anyone with just your vast knowledge and expertise, if you have thoughts about how you've made things packageable for use from both for caseworkers, therapists, and clients, or at least the thought process that comes behind that. Thank you.
That's such an important observation, and there is just an overwhelming amount of information out there, and figuring out ways to pull it together can be certainly daunting. I agree with you. I mean, I can imagine that would be particularly daunting for people who are in immigrant status or the caseworkers working with them. So I don't have an immediate answer to that. However, I think it's really important to sort of maybe within organizations as best we can to try to acknowledge that, and then also organize resources in a way that are palatable and that do provide the most overarching and information first. What do you think, Yamile?
I agree, like prioritizing the information that it's most important in terms of resources. And I think in times like this, less is more. So the more you can sort of do bullet points and share, tidbits of information, it's better. It's really hard for people to grasp long paragraphs or booklets of information. So the more you can synthesize it, I think the better.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
All right, next we have Veronica. Veronica, if you still want to speak on mic, we've gone ahead and given permission. I feel weird saying that. Given permission for you to go ahead and speak. You would just have to unmute your mic on your end. All right.
Seems like people are having trouble with the unmute option.
Yes.
The chat. Yeah.
Mhm. I see someone just unmuted themselves. Ada or Ada?
Ada.
Ada, okay.
Ada.
I was like, oh, I'm gonna mess this up. I'm so sorry.
I've been longing to be your student. I love it.
Oh,
Thanks for the great presentation.
thank you.
That's so wonderful.
Thank you.
Many Chinese students reach out to me because they are still in the field and they want to start some kind of a support group via Zoom. So I think, I don't know how to, I actually haven't done it myself. I haven't done it before. So do you have any idea how to run a support group? Maybe not really psychoed, but I think there may be component that people can adopt to run a support group, you know, via Zoom. Not Zoom, actually, I think it's just a phone via a phone platform or something. We have something, some application within the Chinese community circle. So they are not doing Zoom. No, they cannot even assess the facial expression. So talking about trying to support those socially and physically isolated seniors if they live alone at home. Do you have any idea how to start that thing? I thought I'm going to ask you privately, but since I'm on, so I'm talking about it.
I mean, it's a wonderful idea. And certainly I can imagine that right now people would be feeling completely lonely,
Yeah.
especially among the elders. And you're speaking particularly about the Chinese American community
Yeah.
and also about the students, right?
The student is trying to help.
So even, I mean, I certainly think it's possible if they could figure out a way to set up
Technologically.
a group on the telephone and then create some even just questions for discussion or things to think about together. It could be a really rich resource. I do think it might take a student or somebody who's pretty facile with even with phone technology to get it started. That would be what I would imagine. It's a great thought.
And I also think that people in the audience have shared, like, how do you assess sort of body language in this chat rooms or in this virtual world? And so one of the ways is just talking about it, because you're not going to be able to necessarily see it, and just say, you know, pay attention to your body, your reactions, your movements, and what could they mean? So that's a way of bringing it up without necessarily targeting a particular person, or because you're not going to be able to observe their full body behavior. But I think just opening it up, and that maybe be part of the psychoeducation, might be an important component as well.
And then helping people recognize their own reactions, as Yamile said. So even, you know, and then silence is also something important to notice. If somebody's not speaking, I mean, you can, you know, if you know who is on the call or who is in the room, as it were, you can recognize silence.
Yeah, I think that right now I have a large group of students from our school pairing with the Chinese immigrant elders in the community, calling them a couple times a week to make sure they're okay, and then sort of the co-learning approach. So I told sort of when we recruit these seniors, because they don't want to be helped, so we ask them to help our social work students to support them during this crisis. So it works.
Oh,
so
good.
Learning so much.
Yeah.
This, you know, so crazy time period. But thank you so much.
Thank you, Ada.
You guys' voice. Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, that's all the hands that were raised.
Okay.
There was a question here in the chat box about how to offer psychoeducation to her staff and separately to parents at an elementary school. Our school is closed, so it would be 3 Google Meets. Do you think a one-time meeting is okay? I mean, a one-time meet, I mean, certainly more than one would be better than one. However, orienting people through a one-time meeting on sort of what to think about and what to notice can be really healing. So that's my experience. I haven't tried this in the midst of this COVID-19 pandemic, except to try to think through, as we did today, some of the major components. But I think it would be more than worth trying. What do you think, Yamile?
Yeah, I agree. And I agree that it would be very useful for both groups. So it's more than worth trying, yes.
Just looking to see if there are any other comments in the chat.
We still have a couple of questions from the Q&A.
Great.
Some of our audience members would love to hear a little bit more about creating meaning. So what are some ways that you're creating meaning, and can you speak a little bit about the power of that in this time?
Mm-hmm.
So it is a process, and as people are in the midst of a crisis like this, it can be really challenging. Part of some of the techniques that we would use would be through stories. So helping people to share stories, and sometimes in their stories, just by saying something out loud about their life or their experience or their culture, they realize that there is some meaning there in spite of the awfulness that's going on. So that's one thing. Yamile talked earlier about attending to tiny events during the day. One of my, there's a young colleague who's been posting on Instagram every day, and I've just been following this with delight. Three tiny things that were positive today. And she's been doing this for 3 or 4 or 5 weeks. She's a young attorney working with women whose children have been removed by ACS. So I know she's in her own way on the front lines. So I think that's another way to make meaning. So Yamile?
Yeah, I think that, and also always having a component of reflection and allowing the space after we share the stories or share those small moments to sort of reflect, even in silence. Meaning can be created to allow for that process to go on. Sometimes we are kind of rushing through things and share, but don't take a minute to pause and think about what that means for us or to the other. So I think that's sort of a good combination of both the meaning process and reflection.
Wonderful, thank you. And then Candace wants to know, are there cases when psychoed would not be appropriate?
Yes, that's a really good question too. So the timing is important. So when people are absolutely in the midst of a crisis, for example, if they have no food or money, it would be really hard to work with them around psychoeducational principles, because they're so focused on their immediate lives, and that it's the sort of the principles of disaster relief, that you need to attend to food and safety before you attend to the next stages. So very early on in the process, it might not be, psychoeducation might not be called on or called for. People also would not be able to take in the information for whatever reason. It's just too much. So that's a really good question.
Wonderful, thank you. And then Jennifer wants to know, what this looks like in comparison with other interventions. So how is this different from coaching or motivational interviewing, or are these things that are intertwined in the process?
Yes, they are intertwined. They're definitely intertwined. So just referring back to what we were saying in terms of theory, motivation, some of the techniques of motivational interviewing are critical to psychoeducation, including particularly reflective listening and amplification, which is really important in terms of listening to stories and bearing witness. And I'm sorry, what was the second? It was motivational interviewing, or what was the other one? Sorry.
Coaching.
So, and yes, coaching within a psychoed group, well, the thing with coaching is it's not as much an exchange. Maybe it is. I mean, I haven't worked in capacity as a life coach, for example, so I'm not sure exactly how that model is structured. I would imagine it does have components of psychoeducation in it. I would not say that we're actually coaching people in the context of psychoeducation, although we have used role plays. For example, I've used role plays with folks with severe mental illness as they're preparing for a job interview. So role plays within a group where there certainly is some aspect of coaching, but it's not the entire model.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the ways that it differs, and we talked a little bit about it during the presentation, it's the hierarchical breakage of, me as an expert on a particular intervention, giving it to you. It's really a collaborative process where hierarchy, it sort of crumbles down as the process starts, and I think that's very unique to it. But I do think it's infused by multiple areas of other interventions, as we said, motivation interviewing, coping skills. But this idea of sharing knowledge and experience as a therapeutic way to then lead into how do we sort of problem solve together and work together into it, but without the hierarchy of me, the expert, and you, the person that's going through it, I think it's particularly unique as an intervention.
I want to take a moment to highlight one of the comments from our audience members. So Tony shared that they've said that my life and education gives me certain colors on my palette. Your experience has given you others. Together we can paint a pretty accurate picture. It makes us partners and reduces the hierarchy.
Ooh, I love that.
Yeah,
wow.
me too. So I thought that was a really good comment to kind of highlight here in response to that. So other questions that we have, Kurt wants to know what types of homework do you recommend for your clients to do so that they can continue their mental health and emotional strengthening outside of the counseling experience?
Sometimes go ahead.
So I think kind of working on the things that you like, and that's where we touched on creativity before. So everything from movement to dancing to writing. A lot of people have found that in this time, keeping a journal. I heard of some people keeping a gratitude list every day of what they're grateful for. Connecting with people, as simple as just a call to somebody that you care about, or maybe making sure that you call somebody that you haven't called in this whole process. It can be small things like that, but trying to maintain some sort of mechanisms that help you with in a more consistent way. I think it's part of the homework. So whatever that, some people it's cooking, so whatever works for that particular person, I think it's important to make it individualized, but some things that are creative or outlets for people to express themselves.
And for some, it might be as simple as helping people to think about their resource backpack, or not. So there's sometimes when we don't think about homework, as it were, between sessions, just because of what the circumstances are. So that it has to be planful, mm-hmm. and part of sort of the goals of what we're trying to do.
Thank you. So participants also have brought up a couple of different concepts that I think will be addressed in future webinars, but wondering if maybe you could spend some time to comment on what ambiguous loss looks like in this time. And then other participants brought up the concept of survivor guilt.
So ambiguous loss is, it's a really important construct. And it has to do with the fact that identifying and addressing loss in the context of sort of an ongoing trauma is elusive. And in some cases, some of the losses are not so easy to define. So I think that's really important to consider. And again, naming that and then beginning to try to identify what those losses are helps them to become clearer, or perhaps less ambiguous. What we've found, and again, this is one of the reasons that we titled the session as we did, that naming can be really critical in terms of helping people to gain insight, although it also has to be done really, obviously, thoughtfully and carefully. Yamile, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think you said it beautifully. I think it's lost for different people means different things, and here we tend to gravitate always to human loss of life, and ambiguous loss could also mean, for many of the families that we know are not able to mourn the people that they physically lost. Just the process of a burial, the process of a meaning a funeral home, receiving the love and care of your community, it is a loss in itself, and it's not necessarily a loss that we call a loss, because that's not what we typically have done when people have passed away. So that's part of the ambiguity of something that we have never gone through and that has so many uncertainties and unknowns. So I think expanding that and being okay with not okay in the sense of being comfortable with it, but just acknowledging that there's a lot of ambiguous loss happening around us.
And recognizing that there's so many losses that we haven't even begun to identify.
Yeah.
I mean, I keep thinking of something new, a new loss every day, and it is kind of overwhelming.
Yeah. And then for the concept of survival guilt, I think that, again, it looks very different for different people. Some people feel guilty that they're not in the front lines, or they're staying home, they're comfortable, they have a roof over their head, they have secure employment, and when you see everything that's happening sort of outside of your window, there is sort of a guilt of having this level of comfort in a way, even if you are going through a difficult time. For others is, I know personally people who have survived COVID-19 and who have survive it well, quote unquote, and so why me and not the I'm lucky, but acknowledging and feeling sort of guilty about how lucky they are. And so I think it differs person by person. The particular circumstances of what you're living might give you that sense of survival guilt, and I think it's a matter of being aware and creating awareness of it, and also why do you feel that way and how can you cope with it, so that the guilt doesn't become something that sort of eats you up or creates more anxiety, more fear, more uncertainty in you.
Thank you so much. And we have another question. As all of us are thinking of and attending to our health perhaps in new ways, Lashonda wants to know, how do we help clients identify the difference between psychosomatic symptoms of stress versus COVID-19, which I think is a really interesting topic to address in this time.
Wow, that's such a critical question. I think, helping people sort that out. And I know that that's been a real issue at the testing centers, that people are in a panic, which I think I would be too if I started to have the symptoms. So how do you then sort out whether shortness of breath is a true symptom of COVID-19 or a symptom of anxiety? I think that probably the most fundamental is to help people understand that some shortness of breath could be a symptom of stress, and that it's possible under these circumstances, actually very likely, that people might begin to hyperventilate because they were anxious about the possibility of becoming ill. So again, just naming it and recognizing that can be helpful to people. Because it may enable them to step back and realize, well, wait a minute, that's the only symptom I have. Of course, it could be one of many. However, educating people about that is pretty critical.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. And then, I see we only have about 3 minutes left. We have one question on mindfulness, and I know you touched on this earlier on, but just as a logistics question, do you typically do the same mindfulness or grounding exercise at the beginning or the end, or do you have any other practices to share in mindfulness that you are particularly fond of or have found to be particularly helpful in your work?
That's a really good question. I think there's a meditation or mindfulness exercise where people imagine that they're putting their worries in a box and putting it under their chair, and then just sort of sitting quietly for 2 or 3 minutes. So that's one that I've used and that has been very effective. I've also found that there are times when mindfulness exercises, just because of who's in the group, just don't work. So you have to be really careful. I think with the young women that we worked with, the bell, the meditation bell was so effective because it didn't require them to try to be mindful, except through focusing on the sound, which they were able to do. So, yeah, I think you can be creative. They also shouldn't go on for too long. I think that's another important ground rule, as it were.
And I think you can start with one, and maybe as the group shapes and you start getting to know people, it might be that they like music more than silence, or they like a particular tradition that they come from to be used. So you also learn from your audience, and you can shift it and mold it that way.
In the Seeking Safety program, people use quotes. They use quotes as a sort of a grounding exercise at the beginning to enter into the discussion. So that would be, it could be another tool. So quotes to encourage the group to reflect on something important or meaningful. There are a lot of different tools.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It looks like we've covered most of the questions here in the box. So, looking that we have about 1 minute left, I'm wondering if either of you have anything else you want to share, any other words of wisdom as we embark on this work?
For me, I've so much valued working on this with you, Yamile, with you, Anna, and Tiffany. It's been quite, and I'm so pleased to work with everybody, all of you as participants. So thank you again.
Yeah, that's the same. We're lucky to be able to share some information, and hopefully that could translate into being helpful in some way for the individuals or the people we work with. So grateful for the community that we have built in this process.
And we love your questions. They've all been wonderful. So thank you for that too. Comments and questions.
All right, thank you guys. So with that, we're gonna come to an end. I am just going to say that about 10 years ago now, I was a student of Ellen Lukens, and that was my introduction to psychoeducation, and had the privilege of being supervised by her and leading a psychoeducation group. So it's just an honor to be able to come and just be able to be here through this office and supporting your ongoing work in this area. All right, thank you guys, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.